Make sure to follow us on Instagram at Whistlethrowers. It's a great way to interact with our show. Our DMs are always open for questions, topic discussions, and more. You will be able to find our new episodes and other announcements there.
It's going to be a lot trickier because I don't know if Harden is a number one option anymore. No, actually, I do know. He's not.
All right, thanks for tuning back into the Whistlethrowers podcast. This is Jack Mubarak, joined by
Jack Slaymaker
and Aiden Tiksinski.
So we're going to start with the NFL really quickly. The biggest question around the NFL offseason was going to be where CJ Gardner Johnson was going to play football next year. And we finally got our answer. He signed a 1-year, $8 million contract over with the Detroit Lions. And just initial thoughts on that.
Yeah, this is a big loss for the Eagles on the defensive side. Gardner Johnson was a big part of what they did. I don't really want to focus too much on the negative for the Eagles as much of how big of a positive this is for the Detroit Lions. Last year, they had a really good offense. Numbers were top 10. Their quarterback was having a resurgence, a resurrection of career. Their weapons look really good. They just struggled a little bit to stay on the field, but they lacked so much on defense, especially a playmaker. Getting CJ Gardner Johnson at a very affordable price for them is a huge, huge move. And I'm excited to see where this Detroit team really goes this year because they play in a semi-weak division where you have Bears twice, Packers on a decline twice, and then a Minnesota team that you're pretty much on the same level as now. I'm interested to see where they end up in the rankings and the standings this year in the NFC.
Yeah, so I just want to start out, first of all, by saying that it seems to me that a lot of people question this decision, especially Eagles fans, wondering about why he only took a 1-year, $8 million contract when it seemed like the Eagles gave him a bigger contract for more years. And the fact that people seem to be arguing that the Lions are a much lesser team. First of all, I will never, ever argue with anyone that thinks that they're making a better financial decision for themselves, even if they are making millions of dollars. If that's the decision you want to go with, that's fine, as long as you're also going to contender. The Lions are a sneaky pick to represent the NFC in the Super Bowl this year. I'm going with that. And I think a lot of other people, too. When you look at this defense last year, they were young. They're still young. And Slay, like you said, they didn't have a playmaker. The defensive backs. They had a great defensive lineman in Aiden Hutchinson. I think he still should have won Defensive Player of the Year. I will die by that statement. But when you look at now, they have CJ Gardner Johnson. They've got a really aggressive defensive line. Now you have a guy that can get interceptions. It's a great fit, and I trust their offensive lot. I trust what they're doing at all their other levels, and now they got a solid defensive player. I love that. Now I'm going to go into the contract a little bit. So the Eagles they lowballed him hard. Yes, it was a 3-year, $24 million contract. However, CJ Gardner Johnson was not going to get most of that money until his third year. There is a good chance that if his play declined, the Eagles would have cut them before that third year, and he would have not seen a dime. And that's not fair to a guy who was the Eagles' best defensive player, one of the best defensive players in the entire NFL, and led the league in interceptions. That dude should have been making $8 million a year with the Eagles, with most of that guaranteed. So the fact the Eagles didn't do that, and he wants to bet on himself with a team that's set up to be a contender this year, I love that for him. I think that was the right decision for him. I understand also what the Eagles were doing, though, that they wanted to give him less money now with the fact that they'll be paying some of these guys and have a low cap space. Like, I don't blame the Eagles for a second for setting up the contract the way they did, but I also understand why CJ didn't want to stay. And at the end of the day, I think both parties did what was best for them. And therefore, I can't be angry at CJ for leaving or at the Eagles for the way they set up that contract.
Yeah, I have to agree with both of you. Like, obviously, I don't see what the Eagles were trying to do by not placing CJ in higher of priority against, like, some of these other guys, especially since we've been losing so many guys on both sides of the field, but especially on the defensive end. So it's going to be a big loss for Philly. However, CJ made the right choice for him, his family, and his camp to go to a sneaky contender, like Aiden said. Like, the sky is the limit for that team, seriously, now that they're getting all these new pieces coming in from the momentum they had last year. However, I really do think that all the buildup for his contract was kind of like anticlimactic almost, because you thought he was going to get way more than $8 million if he was like arguing with the Eagles a lot over how much he's going to get paid over there. So for him getting a 1-year deal for $8 million, I'm just a little shocked by that. I was expecting a little more if he was going to leave a contender like that.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And like, I think the initial shock, more information came out, and it does make a little more sense. Like, he's betting on himself for this year. And I want to preface this too by saying I think if he signed that 3-year extension with the Eagles, he was going to get every penny out of that, because I think in 3 years, he's still going to be one of the top safeties in the league, and I think the Eagles wouldn't have had a reason to cut him. However, with this prove-it deal, the 1 year, $8 million, he's going to be a free agent next summer too. He could cash into a really big extension somewhere else or in Detroit. And Detroit is a team that's pushing a lot of cap room back. They had a lot this year. They're going to have a lot next year, it looks like. Granted, that could change, but for the time being, that's what it is appearing as what's going to happen. Gardner Johnson, I think, is going to play his butt off just like he did in Philadelphia. He's going to do it in Detroit too. And he's going to cash in big time next offseason. And who knows? I mean, Philly is probably saying to him during these discussions, like, we want to pay you what you want, but we are so handcuffed by the cap right now that we can't. I think that's why they offered him that extension where they just kicked the can down the road with all the money. Who knows? They may have said to him, yo, if you go out and ball next year, we're going to be one of the first teams on the phone with you when you're a free agent next time, which I think is a smart move for Philly because we all know Howie is a magician of the cap. I think he'll be able to make room next offseason for a guy like that.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And that's why I hope that Philly didn't burn any bridges with the way that this ended, because I could tell that the fans are very disappointed.
Yeah.
But if Howie still is in good contact with CJ Gardner Johnson, there's no reason why he wouldn't consider going back to the Eagles next year. Or if things go really well, the Lions, why he wouldn't consider going there.
Yep.
And that's where I think he wanted to sort of play the field a little bit and see what happens, because we have no idea if the Eagles will still be contenders with everyone that they've lost in the 3 years. And if you're handcuffed in that third year as well, that's something else you got to think about. Where now you're going to a Lions team that's just as young as the Eagles, but they have a more veteran quarterback. You've got a bit more experienced players than the Eagles had last year. So now you're sort of at a position where you can still continue to win. And in that retrospect, too, I don't blame him for the way this happened. But again, I could see him going back to the Eagles as well. That's definitely something we've seen players do, where they leave a team after a year, go with another team. Maybe it doesn't work out. Maybe it was okay. But then they go back to the team that they feel more comfortable with. And I think that's sort of what he wants to do, is see what team he's comfortable with before signing a long-term contract that he feels he's getting his best contract out of.
So that's basically all we have for the NFL. We can move to the NBA really quick. We can start with the Sixers and Joel Embiid. So this was recorded on March 21st. So yesterday they went to double overtime with the Chicago Bulls. They lost in a nail-biter. Embiid has had 10 consecutive 30-point games, and that's been outshined by him getting fouled out and them losing in double overtime to the Chicago Bulls.
Yeah.
So, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, the Sixers have looked absolutely unstoppable the last, 2 weeks or so. You know, that snapped an 8-game win streak, so you're talking 8 of your last 9. The offense looked unstoppable in that stretch, but last night they took a step back. I'm not putting too much worry into the outcome of the game or how they looked, because Harden looked terrible and everything. I think it's time to focus on what Embiid is doing and just trust that everyone will be as consistent as they were for that stretch and not like what they were last night. I mean, what Embiid is doing right now has been unseen by a center in NBA history. There has never been a center that can score with the ability that Joel Embiid has. This is just another thing that you can add to the long list of Joel Embiid as first center, since you're always talking Shaq or Hakeem or Kareem, or he's by himself. And now 10 straight 30-plus point games is tied with Shaquille O'Neal for the longest since 2001. I mean, who knows? He'll probably break it with the way he's been playing, and just the fact that he's looked absolutely unguardable on all 3 levels. During this 10-game, 30-point stretch, he's shooting 61 from the field. He's shooting over 40% from 3, over 85% from the free throw line. Those are guard numbers. And we are seeing it from a dude who is 7'2", 300 pounds. It's never, ever, ever been seen before. And you can't tell me otherwise.
Not only has Embiid gotten over 30 points the last 10 games, he's gotten over 35 in 7 of them, and double-doubles in 3 out of the last 4 games. Like, that is just... It's like you mentioned that we've never seen this before. But when you hear those stats and break it down even farther about what he's doing, it's just mind-blowing how dominant he's been down this stretch. And you mentioned guys are going to need to step up. The biggest piece that needs to step up is James Harden. What he did last night was just awful. 5 points, 7 rebounds, 12 assists, 2 of 14 from field goals, 0 of 6 from 3. That is not acceptable numbers for the guy that's supposed to be the number 2 scorer on the team at all. And the other issue is that they had PJ Tucker out last night too, who we've mentioned on the podcast before, is not scoring at elite numbers anymore, or even numbers that he had 3 years ago, which were not elite scoring numbers, but his defense is solid. House is not that solid of a defensive player, especially when you compare him to someone like PJ Tucker. And the fact that House was only able to put up 4 points in between that is not looking good. Jordan Yang also scored 0 points. Jalen McDaniels also scored 0 points off the bench, and they both had decent amount of playing time. So that you know that the bench is not going to be where you want it to be for the playoffs, at least for the most part. Maybe one guy will step up, like the way DeAnthony Melton scored 19, and that was basically it off the bench. So the Sixers really can only rely on 1 or 2 players off the bench. You have to hope that Harden plays better than he did last night. So for the most part, you're going to have to lean on Embiid throughout the rest of the stretch into the playoffs. And you have to be concerned that Embiid might get hurt at some point if you play him too much, if you keep trusting him to do too much at this point in the regular season. But the issue is that you are still behind the Celtics and Bucks, and you need one of those top 2 seeds, in my opinion, to compete. I don't want to go into Boston in a 7-game series, with Game 7 being in Boston. That is not a good situation for a Sixers team that has struggled against the Celtics this year to be in. Also, you want to be higher than Milwaukee because you know that's a team you can beat, but trying to beat them in 7 games in Milwaukee is going to be tough. So I think the Sixers still need to play for that top spot if that is possible, which at this point it is. And I just don't know if they're going to be able to do that if only Embiid is playing at this level.
Yeah, I hope this isn't like a preview of playoff Harden because he's never been that bad in the playoffs, but he's choked various amount of times in the playoffs in the past. However, I did notice when Embiid went out, the Sixers did look defeated and they had no game plan. Like Maxey was taking ridiculous shots for that Embiid was out for, and Embiid is going to get in foul trouble, especially in those like physical playoff games. And like if he goes out, like what are you to do? Like,
yeah, that's where you need your guy Harden to play better. And I mean, he has played extremely well this whole season, and he's never had a game that was that terrible. And I think that it speaks volumes to what the Bulls are, that Harden played that bad and the game was still that close. It wasn't just Harden either. You know, Aiden rattled off a couple guys. McDaniels, House, Niang. You mentioned Maxey. We can throw in Tobias Harris. We can throw in a bunch of guys. Milton. You know, the Sixers go deep. You know, deeper than most teams of the caliber the Sixers play at. The Sixers usually go 9 or 10 guys off the bench, and you need them to play at a level that they've been playing at. I mean, we can look in since the All-Star break, Sixers have been the best team in the NBA by any number you put it, net rating, record, whatever you want. And they've had the hardest schedule since the All-Star break. So my point being is the guys that are under Embiid have played really well. And that's why I'm not going to look too much into that game because they were horrible. But I don't believe that's what that team will be at when we are talking in April. Back to what Aiden was saying about the Embiid injury. This is sort of the time of the year when something scary happens to Joel and he ends up being banged up once we go into the first round of the playoffs. Yeah, that's scary. But the thing that has helped so far, which, I mean, this isn't going to be able to be held up for much longer, but Embiid hasn't played the fourth quarter in most of these games that they've been winning. You know, he's been being pulled out of the fourth quarter because they're up so much. That helps a lot. So you got to avoid these games like they had last night. When you get an opponent like Chicago, put them away in 3 quarters so you can throw Embiid on the bench and you don't have to worry anymore. If Embiid can stay healthy, the Sixers will contend for the East. But if Embiid is banged up again like he was last year and the year before, and most of the years we've been in the playoffs, it's going to be a lot trickier because I don't know if Harden is a number 1 option anymore. No, actually, I do know. He's not. You can't lean on a guy like Harden in the playoffs. And frankly, you can't lean on a young guy like Maxey either. And we've already seen Tobias Harris, who eats up so much of the Sixers cap, to be that non-existent. You can't rely on him either. So you need Embiid to be on the floor at full health.
Yeah, I do want to point out quickly, like, something that you mentioned is that he has sat out the fourth quarter a lot. When you look at his numbers, in 3 games of this 10-game stretch, he's only played 28, 29 and 30 minutes. And there was one game where he also played 31. So when you're playing that few, that is something that I didn't allude to that you mentioned, which I think is a really important point. And in fact, he's putting up those great scoring numbers. Even playing those few minutes is really just incredible. But when you play 44 in this one game, that does concern me a little bit if there is closer games like this down the stretch.
Yeah.
But again, this might just be something that's an outlier. It remains to be seen. But if Harden keeps playing like that, then this won't be an outlier, and that will be concerning.
Yeah, 100%.
So we just talked about a team that did really well since the All-Star break. Let's talk about a team that didn't do so well with the Boston Celtics. Like, what do they have to do to get back on track?
It's kind of been weird watching the Celtics of recent. I mean, I'll even go before the All-Star break too. You can even go into January with this, but they have not played like the Boston Celtics of the past. You know, the Celtics with Tatum and Brown have always been a prolific offensive team, and with the length that those two guys have, the defense has been not necessarily locked down, but very close to lockdown. It's been very tough to score on a team like Boston. They have a guy like Al Horford in the paint who has a veteran rim presence. Robert Williams, who has just struggled to stay on the court, but when he's on the court, same thing. Just a rim presence there. But recently, they have really, really been discombobulated on offense is like the best way to put it. They don't get great shots anymore like they used to. I feel like they used to be able to create for Tatum a lot more with off-ball movement and getting Tatum the ball in spots he likes. I'm not really sure what it is right now, but Tatum has been struggling to find his groove. And I think that that's the key, is just working with him and figuring out, how do we get you into the spots you love? What are we going to do to fix some of that where Tatum is just taking bad shots? The shot selection has been bad. And Brown has been better. But same thing, like he could even use a little bit of a push in the right direction with, we're not getting the shots we want. We're not taking great shots. We're not moving the ball to get great shots. We're taking okay shots. That's going to hurt you. But I think that they still have enough time, even though we're at the stretch run of the end of the season. They still have enough time before the playoffs begin to sort of figure this thing out. And if Boston, from this moment on to the last game of the regular season, if they get really hot, that's going to be a team that's probably the favorite in the East.
What worries me about the Celtics is that they've been really hot at certain points, and then when they cool down, they go ice cold.
Right.
And that's not a recipe for success in the playoffs. You have to be on every game, and even in games that you lose, you can't let that deteriorate your motivation. And what seems to me what happens with the Celtics is the moment they lose a couple of close games, it becomes sort of a repetition of them losing these close games. You look at what happened in that one stretch with the Knicks losing in double overtime, and then they lost the Cavs in overtime after losing the Nets by 10. So these aren't like blowout games, and it's not something that like I'm totally understanding what's going wrong, because when you lose games in overtime, it's not necessarily that you like lost it badly. It's just sort of whoever had a hotter stretch in the last 5 minutes will win the game, or 10 minutes in the double overtime game. But what seems to happen to me is they're just getting tired because they're playing so many longer games and playing so many close games. When you start losing those, that fatigue that is set in now becomes a bigger mental block, because now you've played all these close games, you lose, and then you play another one, you say, oh man, here we go again. We played them close this late, but we're not going to be able to finish. And then when they become hot, that doesn't really become an issue anymore. And it just seems like everything works. So it just sort of depends to me what Celtics team we see in the playoffs is going to be the big sign how deep they can go on the run. If they lose 2 games in a row, I think a series is over, to me personally.
Yeah.
I don't see how they can lose 2 games in a row and win a 7-game series. If they start out 2-0, I don't see how they lose. So it really depends on the start they have in each series will be the determining factor of how deep they can go in the playoffs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for me, obviously, like at face value, Tatum needs to shoot the ball better, but that's mental. I think eventually he'll get it. If it's not this season, he'll definitely come back next season swinging.
Agreed.
But the thing is with me, like, he's had a lot of bad shooting nights recently, and I look back at when they played the Rockets, and he was having a terrible shooting night that game, and Jaylen Brown had 43 points. Guess who took the last shot? Tatum. Like, why wouldn't you let Brown take the last shot if he's hot and Tatum's cold? Like I get like he's the guy, but he's not playing like the guy, and he hasn't been playing like the guy for a while now. And it just shows like a lack of trust in Jaylen Brown. And I seriously don't think that if they can't rely on other people, because they have a very talented roster, if they can't even rely on their second best option to like close a game out, then they're going to be in big trouble. Also, I think they need to make Joe Mazzulla's job a little easier because obviously he's not as good of a coach for them as Ime Udoka was.
Mm-hmm.
And they're having a lot of trouble adjusting to the different styles of coaching. He's a first-time, like, NBA head coach, and it's not going to be easy for him even with a talented roster like that, so they need to buy in, shoot the ball well, space the floor well, which they have not been doing well, and just, like, play normal basketball, and it just makes the coaching scheme way easier.
Yeah. They need to find that they need to get back on brand is what you're alluding to, and that's very true. And what you were saying about Brown that night too against the Rockets, I agree with you. Like, I feel like you have two number one scorers almost on your team. If Brown isn't a number one, he's very, very close to it. Probably one of the best number two options in the league. Why not ride the hot hand? Like, I agree with you. That is a coaching issue, and that things like that, the small little things, like you might just be like, oh, we're looking too deep into it. But I'm telling you, small little things like that, not getting that guy the ball at the end of the game when he's going off, and you're giving it to the guy who's ice cold that night. Things like that, they stick in a locker room, and that could stick in a guy like Jaylen Brown's head, and that could hurt the team as a whole. They're walking a very thin rope right now. Let's just put it that way, because this thing could come crashing down, because we've seen it. I mean, the Sixers were the one in 2021 and ended up losing to the 5-seeded Atlanta Hawks in 7 games. After losing 3 home games in that series. Like, it is very close to coming down. You're teetering a very, very thin line, and Boston needs to figure it out, because what Aiden was saying is true too. They get really hot and they're almost unstoppable, but when they are off, a team like Milwaukee and Philly is going to ram them. They need to figure it out now, get this momentum building towards the playoffs, so that when you're hitting April, the first round, you have the right step, you have the right foot in front of you, and you're sort of gaining a lot of momentum going into that, because a team like Boston, you want to be playing super hot. I kind of agree with Aiden. It's sort of unsustainable.
Yeah, so I think we'll leave it there with the NBA. March Madness, the last time we talked about March Madness, it was before the tournament started, and now we're in the Sweet 16, so a lot to cover. The floor is yours.
Yeah, I mean, we got to start with the upsets. I mean, there were so many that weekend, and I mean, so many good ones. Like, FDU is the obvious one, taking down just a Goliath, literally and metaphorically. Purdue is one of the top seeds. They have a 7'4" center who has been dominating the entire nation so far. FDU, who doesn't have a player over 6'9" on the roster, handles them fairly easily. I mean, the game was close, but it seemed like Purdue would get close and they just could not finish the punch. And FDU was just throwing haymakers pretty much.
Yeah, it was shocking how badly Purdue played. And I also want to say, not only does FDU not have a player over 6'9", the tallest player that was on the court was 6'6".
Yeah.
There was 2 guys that were 6'6". So they didn't even have that guy playing.
Mm-hmm.
And they were able to just dominate Purdue. And again, it was a close game. But when you look at what they were able to do, they were double teaming guys that were, especially Edey was double teamed most of that game, if not triple teamed.
Mm-hmm.
So you know that he's on the floor. You don't have anyone near him. But FDU was just able to find a way to get past him. And Edey still played well. He still scored 21 points and got 15 rebounds.
Yep.
So it's not even like he was silenced, really. It's just that they were able to stop everyone else. And Purdue's bench only scored 5 points as well, which is just atrocious.
Right, yeah. Really,
really bad. And teams like FDU know how to put your role players in, which is what you have to do in the tournament. And if your role players are off, even if you're a top team, you're not going to win. But the guy that I really want to talk about for FDU is Sean Moore, who just had a great game in that one. 19 points, 5 rebounds, 17-7 from field goal. He was only 3 of 10 from three-pointers, but he still made 3, which is more than anyone else that Farley Dickinson scored, and played 28 minutes as well. They had guys that stepped up when they needed to, and they got it done. And really, there's nothing else to say about it other than Purdue sold so many people's brackets.
Oh.
It's really unfortunate. But we said last week, don't pick Purdue.
Yeah.
I didn't think they'd be out this early, but I didn't think they'd make that deep of a run considering what's happened.
Agreed.
Although I will say that when Virginia lost as the 1 seed to a 16 seed, the next year they did run it back.
Yeah.
So maybe it happens for Purdue. I'm just going to throw it out there.
Yeah. And I mean, they do have a good recruiting class coming up. I'm pretty sure they're in the top 10 of the recruiting class coming in next year. So, yeah, I don't expect them to like fall off a cliff necessarily. But I also don't know if I expect a Virginia-type comeback. Like, I don't know if they have any seniors on that roster who are at the caliber of like a Kyle Guy from Virginia in 2019, where he's just a great player and he is a great locker room presence to rally everyone. I don't know if they have that necessarily. That's kind of my thoughts on Purdue, but then we can talk about the second biggest upset.
Yeah.
Princeton, Ivy League, upsetting one of the best teams in the nation all year. I don't know if Arizona dropped out of the top 10 at all this season. And Arizona, that was a team that, out of all the 2 through 4 seeds in this tournament, Arizona was one of the ones I would have said, no shot, they get upset in the first round because they shoot the ball really well, low turnover percentage, they play defense as a team really well. All those things pretty much went out the window except for their defense. Their defense did play pretty well, but they shot ice cold. Kerr was 0 for 10 from the field, I think, 0 for something from 3. They shot, I believe it was 27% from 3 as a team or something. I mean, they just looked like a completely different team, and that's what you have to fear in March, is you have to stay consistent. You have to play the way you've been playing, and one slip up, and that's it. Your season's over.
Yeah, I mean, so for Arizona, they didn't shoot the ball well at all. But what Princeton also did very, very well is once they got even a little bit of a lead, they slowed down the tempo. Mm-hmm. Arizona's averaged 81 points per game this season. They only scored 55 this game. So even with a cold shooting night, they still should have been able to attack the paint, to get the possessions they needed. But what Princeton did, and they only scored 59, so it's not like they were just flying over the place the way that UMBC did when they beat Virginia, and the way that we saw a couple of St. Peter's, for example, was really, really good about scoring very quickly when they needed to. Princeton did not do that at all. And when you can control the tempo the way you want to, those are usually the teams that win in March Madness. And that's where I really credit the Tigers, is that they did not try to match Arizona when Arizona went on runs. They would let Arizona get a little bit of a lead, chip away at it, and sort of play the style of play that they've played all season. I thought that was really well done, and it showed how well they're coached and disciplined as well. And I do feel a little bit stupid saying last week that I didn't think Princeton was going to be the team to have an upset because they weren't a highly ranked Ivy League school. Well, they proved me wrong. And it's unfortunate that Farley Dickinson didn't move on, but Princeton, after the way that they beat Missouri, this could be that type of St. Peter's run where they now just need to win one more game to get the Elite Eight, which is just crazy.
Yeah, that's really wild to think about. And if you win this one, too, you're one win away from a Final Four, which would be unheard of to have a 15 Ivy League school in the Final Four. It would just be unheard of. And I wanted to point this out, too, before we get into the next big upset of the first round. No 5 seed lost this year, which is normally a trend, is like a couple 5 seeds normally get knocked out. Came close a couple times, like Drake came close to beating Miami. St. Mary's really handled VCU. Duke handled Oral Roberts, which is the one I picked. I picked Oral Roberts.
Charleston played San Diego State really close the whole time, though, and that was the upset that I had.
Yeah.
It looked like they were going to be able to pull it off for a little bit, but San Diego State struggled in that game and then really came through against, I'm forgetting who they played. Oh, they played Furman, so that's a game they should have won by a lot. But obviously they struggled to a lower seed already. Furman wasn't that far behind Charleston in the seeding at least, and they blew them away. Yeah. So it seems like San Diego State is getting their footing at the right time, which could make their matchup against Alabama really dangerous.
Yeah, right. And that's kind of what I want to get into next, because I know like ESPN does this where they call it like the rechance, where you get to pick the Sweet 16 and see if you do better than your real bracket did, which I like that. I want to talk about who you think the favorite is in this tournament now, because obviously 2 1 seeds are out. Kansas lost in the second round. Duke, which was a favorited pick, they're done. But the two or three really that stand out to me as favorites, I'm going Alabama has to be your favorite right now. They're the second overall seed, I think. Like Houston was the number one overall seed, if I'm not mistaken. But
I believe because they went by record for that, yeah.
Yeah, right. And I feel like Alabama played in a better conference, all that.
Yeah.
So I think Alabama's better than them. Then I'd put UCLA over Houston. I think that they're a better team. And then Houston would probably be my 3.
Agreed.
But another thing is, like, who has the easiest path? Because Houston has a really tough path. But then a team like Alabama on the other side, they don't have a team that's seated above 5 in their bracket. Bama has pretty much a cakewalk to the Final Four. I don't want to jinx it for them, but that's just how it's looking on paper, you know?
Well, it depends, because San Diego State, like I said, that could be a problem for them. They've played very well. They played in a very tough Mountain West Conference, too. And even though the SEC was much better than them, that's nothing to scoff at. And San Diego State has gone on deep runs before.
Mm-hmm.
So that will be a tough matchup. After that, who knows if Princeton can upset Creighton. And again, you don't want to say, oh, it's an easy matchup, because that means that Princeton has just run through some of the hardest teams in the tournament to get there.
Yeah.
But it does make it easier for Alabama than if they were playing another hard team. I think the team that might have the easiest run is actually Kansas State.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Michigan State's played very well, for sure, and so has Tennessee. So I could see pretty much any of these teams making it, and even FAU has had a solid run. Although, after getting past Memphis, they had to beat Farley Dixon, who I think most people didn't think was going to win that game.
Yeah.
Kansas State, to me, they were always a bit of a toss-up because they got off to a really hot start and struggled down the end of the season. But it's a team that has played very well, was in the top 10 rankings for a while. And none of these teams – I mean, Tennessee is sort of a top 10 team, but they've struggled at certain points. Michigan State's going on a great run, but I could see Kansas State beating them. I feel like that if Kansas State can win their game and if FAU can pull off an upset, then they've got a pretty easy run. Yeah, I'm just going to say, and by saying that, I could see that as a walkthrough. However, if they have to play Tennessee, then it's a bit more of a toss-up. And if that happens and Alabama wins their game, then I say Alabama has the easiest walkthrough to the end of their Final Four run.
Yeah, the only thing that really scares me for Kansas State is, like what you were saying, they struggled down the stretch. And they've seemed like a hot and cold team, like kind of what we were talking about with Boston in the NBA. They're facing Tom Izzo Magic. Like, that stat is flying around. He has the most NCAA tournament wins as a head coach, being the lower seed. I do agree with you. Like, Kansas State, I feel like on paper again is the better team than Michigan State, and then I feel like they're also better than FAU or Tennessee. And yeah, I think like looking on that side of the bracket, that left side, Alabama's region, and then FAU, Tennessee, Kansas State, Michigan State, like that's pretty much where most of the upsets have happened. And then you go to the other side, like UCLA is going to have a tough Sweet 16 and Elite 8 matchup no matter what. Whether they, you know, because Gonzaga is a really tough team. And then if they win that, they're going to have to play a UConn team that has been really good all year, or an Arkansas team who has had experience. They've been to the Sweet 16 in 2020, and then they went to the Elite 8 last year, I believe. They have an experienced coach. They're playing with a lot of fire. And then like we were saying,
just beat a very good Kansas team too.
Yeah, which was one of the top seeded teams in the tournament. And for Houston, it doesn't get any easier for them either. You have to play a Miami team, which I think Miami is better than Houston. And if you win that, Texas has been playing really hot, who I picked them to lose in the first round, unfortunately. Or Xavier, who had that like debacle, that weird situation in their first round game. Like the players were like fighting. I don't look too much into that or anything.
No, I mean, the other thing too is that Kennesaw State was a team that nobody picked to even win the ASUN. They were picked dead last to win that.
Yeah.
So they were coming in with a lot of momentum, a lot of fire. That was not going to be an easy team, because that was one where I feel like Xavier overlooked their opponent by a lot.
Yeah.
Where I don't feel like that was the case with Virginia losing to Furman. That was just a really bad play. But I also think they understood that Furman was going to be a tough game. And especially that is a team that after what happened against UMBC, Virginia will never overlook an opponent again. Yeah. That's not something that any coach will allow them to do. So I don't think that's what happened in that game. I think that Arizona maybe overlooked Princeton a little bit, but I don't think that was the biggest reason they lost. But I think that it felt to me like Xavier just completely overlooked their opponent and then had to play a very tough Pittsburgh team. And I honestly think that Xavier might have had the hardest schedule because of some of these teams that they've had to play.
Yeah, right.
And now we'll have to play Texas. So if you survive that, maybe you have a shot of winning. But I feel like that once you get to the Elite 8 after beating 3 very tough teams, it's going to be hard to beat a team, especially if you go play either Houston or Miami, who's had a bit easier of a stretch getting through some of their games.
Yeah, I mean, no matter how this weekend shakes up, because after this weekend, obviously we'll know what the Final Four is. No matter how this shakes up, we're going to have at least 3 teams that really haven't been to the Final Four in a long time, which is going to be cool to see. Like Michigan State, I know they just went recently. That was 2019, I believe.
Yeah, I think
UCLA has gone the last couple. They went 2021, I believe. But yeah, like Arkansas, UConn, we haven't really seen a lot of these teams. And then, the obvious ones like Princeton, if they could make it, that would be probably the best Cinderella run we've ever seen. That would definitely
but even if Creighton makes it, because they're not a team, I mean, we could potentially see 3 Big East teams in the Final Four, which would be nuts.
That would be insane.
If that happened.
Yeah. I think that would earn a lot of respect for the Big East. But I guess we can move into the World Baseball Classic now. I just wanted to talk about that epic game last night. Mexico and Japan. That was a great semifinal. Like, you can start with just the atmosphere itself. Just a ton of people there supporting the countries. And we all know nothing gets more tense than when it's country versus country and there's no fan bases that really like come alive other than a fan base that is rooting for their country. There's a lot of love in that. And I just loved watching all of the Mexico fan base show up. They packed the stadium. Miami is a big Hispanic city for the United States. So Miami, it being in Miami, Mexico had almost a home field advantage without it being in their country. That's needless to say, Japan showed out too. There were a ton of Japanese fans there supporting their team. Like, that was so cool to see. And then the game itself was just epic. 3-0 the whole way for Mexico. Japan ties it. They fight back and forth. Walk-off home run. I mean, that was just a classic moment.
It was one of my favorite moments of that entire thing was Randy Arozarena catching that ball.
Yeah.
Where, first of all, he had said something about Japan's pitcher where this dude has been just unbelievable. And Randy was asked about him and said, basically, like, you're going up against this great pitcher. Like, what do you expect to happen? He's like, I expect him to lose. Like, this dude just has played with so much confidence. He's played very well in big moments, if you remember the 2020 postseason. Yep. But that catch where he just stared down the batter.
That was so cool.
Awesome. I just want to push back on people that have said that he is not Mexican, so he shouldn't be playing for Mexico. Yeah. First of all, this guy deported from Cuba, had no home country for a couple of years, and asked the president of Cuba, because he went from Mexico, because he went from Cuba to Mexico. He asked the president of Mexico, can I be a Mexican resident to represent you guys? Because you were my first country when I left Cuba. Like, that is just a very, very cool moment. It shows how much love he has for the country that let him in. And the fact he now gets to represent them in the World Baseball Classic is just so cool. Or he got to until that loss last night, unfortunately.
Yeah, and another thing people are just failing to realize is Cuba almost held Randy Arozarena prisoner with baseball because if you remember, they wouldn't let him go to the Caribbean Classic, which was held in Puerto Rico in 2015. They hold that semi-annually. They wouldn't let Randy Arozarena be on that team or represent Cuba in Puerto Rico because they were afraid he was going to defect. So they pretty much held him prisoner. I don't understand why anyone would be against him not wanting to play for that country. I don't see any problem with it either. I think that people look too much into that. I mean, Lars Nootbaar is playing for Japan too, and like he has American-born parents, but he lived in Japan. He had citizenship in Japan. I don't see the issue with him playing for Japan. Yeah, I agree with you. There's just been way too much made about like who people play for and stuff, and it stems off of Randy Arozarena too, but yeah, I completely agree with that.
It happens all the time in other sports.
Yeah,
like
even soccer.
Born in Australia, played in the U.S. for a while.
Yep.
It happens so much in the World Cup, too.
Yeah.
A lot of the guys the majority of the France guys weren't from France.
Yeah, right.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I think what's also been really cool is that there has been a lot of pushback by Major League fans, which is somewhat understandable when you worry about guys getting hurt, that they're not always playing with their team in spring training. You wonder how that's going to affect them. But when you look at what this has done for the growth of baseball internationally, something like 75% of people that live in Japan, Japanese citizens, were watching Japan play.
Yeah.
When you look at what was Puerto Rico, or something like 61% of Puerto Ricans were watching the game between them and the Dominican Republic. And a lot of Dominican Republic fans were watching as well. So what this will do now is allow for international fans to grow closer to Major League Baseball, because now you can say, hey, this guy represented my country. Let me watch his professional team and root for his professional team. That wasn't happening before. And this is why the World Baseball Classic is becoming so important for Major League Baseball and baseball as a whole, because it's allowing for the international growth.
Yeah.
And this is what Major League Baseball was hoping for. And this is what I think American fans didn't understand until this year, because the World Baseball Classic hadn't been this big. But after 2017 and the amount of international players, and now finally American players that are like the best players in the sport playing for their home countries, it's allowed for people to understand how big this can potentially become and it definitely won't be on the same level as the Soccer World Cup, just because it's only for 2 weeks and not a month. And it's before the Major League Baseball season, so you're not like sitting out. It's right before the Major League Baseball season and not in the off season the way it is for soccer for most European countries. But it will still grow to a level that we have not seen from an international baseball tournament like this.
Agreed.
You guys got anything else?
No, I think we're good.
Okay, so I think that'll do it for this week. We'll catch you next Saturday at 2 p.m. See you next time.